Good afternoon. On today's Angry Bulletin, Elon Musk has spoken at length about how we get to Mars, but what happens when we actually arrive there? What sort of base camp should we set up in order to begin to establish a permanent presence on the red planet? Should we just live inside Starship, or should we look for other alternatives as the human species takes their first steps in becoming a multiplanetary civilization? All of this and more coming at you on The Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon. Once again, welcome to The Angry Astronaut. First of all, I'd like to make a real quick appeal here. During the holiday season, a young boy was shot in the head in Oklahoma while his family was just out looking at Christmas lights. No idea what the motivation was of the person who shot him. Apparently used a laser sight, something along those lines. Obviously a very deliberate thing, cold and calculating, near as I can tell. In any event, the child is currently struggling for his life in the hospital, and the last thing his mother needs to do while she's at his bedside is worry about the fact that she can't work and she can't pay bills. They have a GoFundMe page up right now. I have it in the description if you would like to contribute. This is the time of year to contribute to these kinds of causes, in my opinion. Okay, let's move on to more pleasant topics. So, we've talked about Elon Musk's plans about getting to Mars for a very long period of time now. There's been lots of discussion as to how Starship is going to do this, how many refueling missions it will require, how the landing will take place, etc., etc., but not a whole lot of discussion as to what Elon Musk's first Mars base is actually going to look like. What would be the best plan to set up your first established base on Mars? There hasn't been a great deal of discussion about what you do when you get to Mars. How do you establish a presence there? Now, many people have discussed the idea of just living inside Starship. It is, after all, a very big rocket, very big fairing, perfect place really to get established and to set up a base of your own and just live there. I mean, lots and lots of space, about 1,000 cubic meters, a little bit more than that, actually. So why not just do that? Well, there are problems with this idea. I mean, first of all, keep in mind, Starship is a reusable transport system. And if you don't reuse it, that means that you are essentially throwing the orbiter away, throwing the rocket away. Yeah, you're using it as a base when you get established on Mars, but nevertheless, you're never going to use it again for anything else if that's going to be your home. Is that really the best use for Starship? I argue that it isn't. Because if you have to throw the rocket away, it's essentially the same as relocating your family to a new destination. Let's say you move from New York to San Francisco, and then after you move, you decide to just live inside your motorhome. Oh, and also take the wheels off. So you just get established there permanently, and you have to pay for the entire motorhome, and that's your new place to live. I don't think that is the best way to make use of Starship. Starship is at its best when it's a reusable transport system. I think the cost per colonist to get people to Mars is going to drop off considerably if you keep using the same Starship over and over again for transport purposes rather than a permanent habitable space that you get to use essentially once. I think it sort of defeats the purpose of Starship and kind of goes against the grain of what SpaceX is all about, reusability. I mean, that's what's made Falcon 9 so incredibly successful, is the fact that they reuse it over and over and over again. Makes the cost of getting into space, the cost of getting to Mars, far more affordable. So then what do you do? If you're not going to use Starship to live in, then how do you establish a base on Mars? What is the best plan for a Mars base camp for the first Mars colonists? Well, some students from an international organization dedicated towards the idea of establishing a Mars colony, they came up with a pretty interesting plan. The paper's linked in the description, but we're going to go over it right now. In 2017, an organization called the Space Station Design Workshop, or SSDW, in Stuttgart, Germany, posed the challenge to conduct the preliminary analysis and develop a viable proposal for the establishment of a permanent crewed space station in the vicinity of Mars by the year 2030. Two multinational interdisciplinary teams of 20 students each were given 1 week to develop their own solutions and present them to experts from industry and academia. This particular solution was put forward by a group called Team Blue, and the name of their proposal was Humans to Mars. Now, first of all, where do you establish a base on Mars? It's tough because there are many good prospects. I don't necessarily agree with their location, but it does make a lot of sense. Where they think the first base should be established is Gale Crater. And again, makes a lot of sense because we know a hell of a lot about this location. It is, after all, where the Curiosity rover has been doing its work for over a decade now. It's also located at 5.4 degrees south of the Mars equator, which means that the temperatures are relatively mild. The milder the temperatures are, the less power you have to use in order to maintain life support, especially heating for your habitat. That's a very serious consideration, so the location makes a lot of sense in that regard. In addition, we suspect that there's quite a lot of subsurface water in the Gale Crater area as well. That also is extremely important for a future colony. On top of that, the high ridges that are present in this crater and also right up against the mountain peak that is at its center, well, according to the Curiosity rover, radiation levels drop off precipitously the closer you get to the crater rim. Apparently, crater rims and cliffs of various kinds provide a tremendous amount of protection against radiation, which is one of the most serious considerations for a future Mars colony. So the location makes a great deal of sense. It's not the sexiest location. I would rather have a base somewhere in the Valles Marineris. It has many of the same advantages, including an equatorial location, high cliffs, probably water ice, that sort of thing, but still, we know way more about Gale Crater because we chose to put Curiosity there. So like the SpaceX mission, the first step is to send an unmanned mission to Mars to establish a lot of the infrastructure you're going to need in order to establish a base without really risking the lives of the astronauts in the process. So you have an orbiter, 2 inflatable habitats, a Mars ascent vehicle, and cargo into what's called a super synchronous orbit with a perigee of 300 kilometers and an apogee of 90,000 kilometers. Now, the reason you do this is this type of orbit allows this whole assembly to get into a Mars transfer orbit a lot easier because at the 90,000 kilometer point, it's substantially easier to escape from Earth's gravity. And in addition to that, at the 300 kilometer point, well, that's very close to Earth, so you can send up the necessary components for the mission. We're not going to get too much into the method of transporting the astronauts between Earth and Mars, though, because we've talked about that quite a number of times. Instead, we need to talk about what happens when they get there. Now, keep in mind, this entire setup, at least to start off with, is unmanned. And once the ship begins to approach, this is a cargo ship, by the way, reaches the sphere of influence of Mars, the Mars ascent vehicle and the cargo are separated. They enter the atmosphere of Mars and touch down in the designated landing zone in Gale Crater, whereas there's an orbiter section of this assembly that stays in Mars stationary orbit. In other words, right over the landing site. Now, you're going to understand why that's important here in just a moment. So once the orbital station and the habitats and cargo are in place on Mars, then and only then does the crew make its way to low Earth orbit in what's called a deep space habitat. And this could be a starship if you want. You can replace starships for the components that we've been talking about in this mission anytime that you like. But nevertheless, once you have the astronauts in low Earth orbit, they make their way to Mars and dock with the orbital station. Once this docking is complete, then they begin to assemble the Mars base in real time using telerobotics. Now, why do we do this? Why don't you just have an automated system with robots assemble the Mars base? Well, because any commands that you're sending from Earth take a huge amount of time to arrive at Mars, and of course responses take a considerable time as well because of light travel time. It's far more efficient to control telerobotics in real time from Mars orbit with a Mars synchronous space station. Once again, this could be a Starship if you want. As I said, Starship can replace the components that they proposed in this whole plan anytime you like. It really doesn't matter. So once you have the ground station operational, oh yeah, if anything goes wrong with that process and you can't assemble the ground station, you simply go back to Earth. But once you have it assembled, then and only then does the crew enter a Mars ascent vehicle and descend to the Martian surface. Keep in mind, you have a Mars ascent vehicle with both the crewed portion of the mission and the cargo portion of the mission because you want to have redundancy built into the system, so if there's some sort of problem with one of the Mars ascent vehicles, then the astronauts are not trapped or stranded on the Mars surface. So incidentally also, I think it's a very good idea for the Mars ascent vehicle to be a modified Crew Dragon, something like a Red Dragon as it was originally proposed by SpaceX back before Starship became a big thing. Why is that the case? Because it's far safer. You can use something like a lofted inflatable heat shield to make the entry a lot slower, a lot easier to control. You can also use parachutes, lots of other systems that will allow a Red Dragon-like transfer vehicle to land far more safely on the Martian surface. In my opinion, if you're landing Starship directly on Mars, that should generally only be used for cargo purposes, not for landing human beings. You can transfer crew back and forth to the orbital station utilizing something like a modified Crew Dragon. And since Mars gravity is only 1/3 that of Earth, you can get your transfer vehicle back up to Mars orbit without a very big rocket at all. So you don't even need, like, say, a Falcon 9 to get the Crew Dragon back up to orbit. You can do it with a modified Crew Dragon on its own. What that means is, as far as a permanent established presence on Mars is concerned, once you have all of this stuff established, you have everything you need to maintain a permanent presence on Mars. You have an orbital station, you have a ground station, and you have transfer vehicles to ferry crew back and forth. And the transfer vehicle, it could be a Starship or some other vehicle to travel between Earth and Mars, that's the only thing that needs to go back and forth between the two locations. Everything else on Mars is a permanently established station both in orbit and on the surface. That's what I like so much about this solution. So what are the surface habitats like? Well, an inflatable structure is proposed as a shelter for the permanent crewed settlement and an environment for research. It's made out of layers of polyethylene with a foldable structural foundation, very similar to what Sierra Space has proposed. The design unit is 12 meters in diameter and 3 meters in height. It has a structural volume of about 348 cubic meters and can be inflated with air. And the one reason why you want to use inflatable habitats is, first of all, it doesn't consume a great deal of space. Obviously, Starship has a massive fairing, but if you have to use any other type of solution, kind of nice to take up as little space as possible, especially if you're deploying 2 of them, plus a Mars ascent vehicle as well. The habitat has 3 doors, 1 main door and 2 redundant doors for the addition of new modules in the future. The inner part is an expandable structure made of carbon composites. But what about the Martian environment? Well, it has to be resistant to environmental forces, obviously, so you cover it with approximately 1.5 meters of 3D printed Martian regolith. Now, recent discoveries on the moon suggest that we may not need this much. much. The Chandrayaan lander, as I mentioned in a previous video, discovered that radiation and extreme cold drops off substantially under just a few centimeters of regolith, so it may require 1/3 of this, or maybe even less than that. And incidentally, although this is not built into the plan that we're talking about here, this solution from Pneumocell, a combination of using reflected light and inflatable structures, is a unique way of protecting a habitat and still providing an enormous amount of natural light. What you have is a platform that holds up a substantial amount of regolith to provide protection from cosmic rays, but reflective mirrors on either side of the habitat that reflect sunlight into the habitat from ground level. Cosmic rays can't get into the habitat with this setup, and yet you still have a substantial amount of natural light to grow plants. Now, the researchers have their own solution for allowing natural light in, but honestly, I think this one is a bit better. But let's get back to the original proposal. I'll be making a video about this habitat in the future. Now, in situ water is going to be absolutely vital to almost every part of this colonization effort. Water is obviously necessary for drinking. Water can also be converted into breathable atmosphere. Water can also be used for fuel. And perhaps most importantly, water acts as a fantastic shield against high-energy radiation and cosmic rays. If you pump water through the outer structure of the inflatable habitat, as these researchers propose, that's an added level of radiation shielding. In addition, you can have skylights and windows that are completely uncovered by 3D printed regolith and instead have caps of ice or perhaps even liquid water in them in order to allow natural light to flow into the habitat. Natural light is extremely important to the psychological well-being of most human beings. Many miners suffer from long-term light deprivation, and there are lots of psychological problems that go with that. Yes, some human beings can adapt quite well, but most human beings really need daily natural light in order to be able to operate properly, and this unique use of water, especially in a skylight, provides that natural light quite efficiently. However, I do think that the other solution we've been looking at so far in this video is actually a bit better, provides a lot more natural light, especially for plants. But here's the thing that I find to be the most compelling about this plan. There's so much redundancy built into it. We've already talked about the redundancy that we have with the Mars ascent vehicles. You have a Mars ascent vehicle both with the crew and with the cargo versions of this mission in case one of them experiences a problem. But you also have two inflatable habitats. These habitats can be repurposed if there are any problems. For example, here's one emergency scenario. Let's say you lose one habitat and instead you're having to put 6 people into one habitat as opposed to 3 in each as was originally intended. Well, the walls, furniture, etc. are designed to be modular. Interior walls can be easily moved, creating or cutting off spaces according to the crew needs. Some laboratory and gym space is lost, but the crew survives, which of course is the most important thing. Also, for medical emergencies, you can repurpose certain areas to act as an expanded hospital, an ICU, that sort of thing. However, there's one thing that I don't agree with when we're talking about this plan, and that is the power supply. They really advocate the idea of using solar panels, although they do acknowledge that a long-term dust storm could really create a problem. They advocate using methane fuel cells to be able to provide the emergency power necessary to make it through a dust storm. But in my opinion, if you are trying to establish a permanent station on Mars that's supposed to last for decades, well, you're not going to make it with solar power alone. alone with a fuel cell backup. You need nuclear power, and fortunately, small nuclear modular reactors, which should be operational by the end of the decade thanks to the efforts of companies like Rolls-Royce, should be able to solve any sort of power supply requirements for a base like this. However, keep in mind, many things that are power supply intensive are taken care of because of how well this plan was thought out. The inflatable base means that you don't have to use lots of power for 3D printing. Only the regolith covering requires 3D printing, which is a lot less complex. The equatorial location means moderate temperatures, means your life support system doesn't have to provide as much heating. There are so many things about this base setup that requires minimal power expenditure, meaning that you can use power for other mission-intensive purposes. And the reusability and long-term aspects of this plan are its greatest strengths as well. Again, to go over this, you have a permanent orbital station to support the base, and it's in Mars synchronous orbit, so it's constantly overhead. It also acts as a communications relay. You have transfer vehicles capable of ferrying passengers back and forth to orbit, so that means the only thing you require is a transfer vehicle to take crew members and cargo to and from the Earth. The rest of the entire setup is self-sustaining. And with the arrival of every new cargo module and every new crew mission, you have more people and more habitable space being added to your Mars facility. Now, granted, in the future, we're going to want larger modules. We're going to want big habitable spaces capable of housing dozens of people or perhaps 100 people. But to start off with, this is an excellent way to establish a small base camp of Mars colonists or Mars pioneers, if you want to call them that, to get a permanent presence established on Mars, to get hydroponics going, to get in situ resource utilization going, and to master the processes necessary in order to support a larger population. And bit by bit, you add another inflatable habitat and another, then larger habitats, bigger power supplies, etc., until eventually you have a Mars city. And isn't that what Elon's wanted all along? Thank you very much for watching. Thanks very much to Thomas over at Numocell for once again allowing me to use his amazing footage. I look forward to talking more about his unique ideas in the future. And please like, please subscribe. It's very important to the future of my channel. And as always, stay angry about space.